Hello everyone and welcome to Tech with Robert, the Get Started with T-SQL course. In this lecture we are briefly going to take a look at the distinct and group by classes, and in upcoming lectures we're going to go through a lot of more examples of when and why you should use group by. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, give a thumbs up on the video if you like what I do. That really helps me to know what I do well and what you guys want me to improve or focus more on in the future lectures. So without further ado, let's dive right into T-SQL. And so we created a lot of queries where we just, up until now, we've just retrieved data and we've applied some basic filtering on the data. We've learned how to work with string values, numeric values, and date and time values. The next step is sort of to understand when we need to group data. And so let's just write a query here. We take the query that we have worked with so far. We say that we want the customer key, the first name, middle name, last name. Now let's say we want the English education and the occupation. So when we run the query like this, we see that this customer over here, his education is a bachelor's degree and the occupation is professional. And so we see that we might not have so many distinct values here, but for each row, for each customer, since we didn't do anything to the query, we just said that we want everything here, we're going to get, you see that both of these customers are bachelors and they have the professional occupation. But what if we, because that is the first thing you will do regardless what you work as. Let's say you work as a data analyst or a BI developer, consultant, or whatever. When you're working with data, the first thing you need to do is sort of get to know the data, analyze the data. See, for example, okay, we're working with sales data. How many sales transactions do we have? How many customers are we working with? From how many countries do we have customers living in, and so forth. So you kind of just get to know the data. So what if we wanted to see here, okay, how many different English occupations are there? And so we could write this query and we could just scroll through the whole of list here, and we could, see here that, and we can try to keep all of these in the head, and we can see, okay, here's professional, and then we scroll down, okay, we have management, then we have two, and then here we have skilled manual. But that is very tedious and it takes a lot of time to scroll through a lot of data, and it's completely unnecessary. What we could do instead is we could say that we want to select the distinct English education from that table. So what that will do is it's going to retrieve a list with the unique values that occur in the English occupations column. So how we write this, that is that we say we want to select the English occupation from the customer, but instead of just selecting it like this, we could say we want to select the distinct English occupation. And so let me just demonstrate here. If we copy this query and we write the same query but without the distinct, so watch what will happen. Let's try again here. Very, very slow. Let's just take this one. Let's see. I wonder why it's so slow. Look, as you can see here, we only get 5 values. So we get all of these. We saw that the value professional occurred a lot of times on a lot of different customers. But when we specify that we want to select a distinct English occupation, we only get each value once. So writing a query like this, it's a lot easier for us to see that, oh, okay, so we have 5 different English occupations, and these are the occupations that we can find in the customers table. And so we could do the same thing for the English education. We write that query like this. So we see, okay, so we have high school, partial college, graduate degree, and bachelor's. And so what if we wanted to see, we wanted to count how many, because we know that every customer has either one of these educations or these occupations here. So what if we wanted to see how many customers have the professional occupation and how many customers have clerical occupation and so on? And as you can imagine, if we just write that query like we did here and just count all of the rows here where we find the value professional, it's very, very tedious, time consuming, and completely unnecessary. So there's a much simpler way to write this, and I'm just briefly now going to introduce aggregate functions. In the upcoming lectures we're going to talk about these in much more detail, but I'm just going to show you here. So what if we wrote a new query where we said we want to select from the dim customer here, and we want to select the English occupation, and we wanted to count how many customers appear in the different categories. So what we could do is we could write an aggregate function called count. So we use count, then open and closing parentheses, and inside here we put star. And then we can give this column an alias, for example, number of rows. And then if we just run this query, look what will happen. We will get an error saying that the English occupation is invalid in the select list because it is not contained in either an aggregate function or the group by clause. So that brings me to the group by clause. And so what the group by clause does is we're selecting a field here and we're applying an aggregate function. And in this case we're counting. So we want to, because we have rows like this, let's say we have 10 rows with customer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on till 10, and then all of them have the occupation, let's say clerical. Instead of just getting 10 rows, we will get one row where we say and we get the number 10 in the row here. So we're grouping or aggregating or summarizing. There are 3 different words to describe this. We're grouping the number of rows based on the column that we want to, the descriptive column here, in this case English occupation. But in order to run this query we need to add the group by clause. So we come here below the query and we say group by, and we need to group it by that field that we have selected here. So we can copy this here and we can say we're going to group this by the English occupation. So if we now run this query, we see that, and we can also add a order by, and we can say order by the number of rows, and we say the descending order. So now if we run this query, we see that out of our 18,000 or how many customers we have, out of these 18,000 customers, 5,500 of them have the professional occupation. 4,577 of them have the skilled manual occupation, and so on. So we're grouping up the data. Think of it as like when you're viewing a bar chart or a line chart, for example, and then you have, for example, you have a very large sales table where you have the sales order ID and you have the sales amount, and then you store the date, for example, so 2020 January the 5th or something like that. You will probably have sales for each of the dates in the year 2020. But when you want to aggregate and see how much sales did we have in 2020 and 2021, for example, you don't want to scroll through the whole list there and so keep track of how many rows there are, and to sort of keep track that this date belongs to 2020. Now we take this value and then we add this value because this rows also belong to the year 2020, stuff like that. So what we could do instead is we could use an aggregate query, and in that case we would just say, for example, we have the year and then we say sum of the sales amount, for example, and then we group by the date, and so we could the year. So then we can see for 2020 we had this much sales, and then for 2021 we had this much sale. Think of it as this an example. We have a table here and we have sales order ID, customer name, and sales amount. So if I just write a query like select everything from this table, I will just get all of these 5 rows, one after the other. And then we can see here that for Robert we had one transaction where he bought for 500. Then we have another transaction where he also bought for 500. And we see Mike bought for 300, James bought for 250, and then James bought another transaction for 200. So the sum of the sales amount is all of these summed together, which gives us 1750. And so if we would write the query like this, for example, we would get the result like this. So we would see that we would only get, we see here in this table we have Robert twice, but in this aggregate query, since we're grouping by the customer name, we're only getting the distinct values, all of the distinct customers. So here we would have Robert once, and it would sum, it would take all of his sales and add them together. So in this case it would be 1000, and it would display 1000 here. And what the count function would do is it will see how many transactions did Robert have. And we see here he had 2 transactions. It would display 2 here in the number of transactions. And the same thing for James. He has 250 plus 200, 450, 2 transactions. But Mike only had 1 transaction with 300, so it's going to display 300, and then here it's going to say 1 transaction. So that is how you group and aggregate data based on the descriptive fields here that you want to analyze the numeric data on. And so this is just a brief introduction to how we can work with the distinct and group by clause. In the upcoming lectures, we're going to take a closer look at all of the different aggregate functions here, like sum, count, min, max, average, and so on. So I will see you guys in the next lecture.